and I saw and I saw Rosine, 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 Rosine, and I saw, and I saw, Absolutely extraordinary. One of 15. And it was just absolutely extraordinary. 2018. And it was just absolutely extraordinary. 2018. And it was just absolutely extraordinary. One of 15. And it was just absolutely extraordinary. 2018. And it was just absolutely extraordinary. 2018. And it was just absolutely extraordinary. One of 15. And it was just absolutely extraordinary. 2018. And one of was just absolutely extraordinary. 2018. And it was just absolutely extraordinary. One of 15. And it was just absolutely extraordinary. 2018. And one of was
one of the one of the one of the society, T is for terror, U is for us, V is for values, W is for wife, X is for Y is for yeoman, Z is for you.
S
Z
is for society. T is for terror. U is for us. V is for values.
C
W
is for children.
is for wife.
Is for domestic.
X
E
is for
everyday.
Y
Is for family.
is for yeoman.
G is for
Z
grave. H
is for
is for Harridan. I is for island.
is for action.
J
B
is for
is for brutality.
K
C is for children. R
is
C
for silence.
is for corruption.
M is for
D
daughters
is for death.
N is for education.
Is for earth.
Is for
Is for grave. H is for Harridan. G is for govern.
Is for quiet.
H is for health.
Is for reform.
A
S
is for
is
alliance.
for sisters. Is for jury.
B
T
is for burden. Is for justice. C is for corruption. N D is for no. Is for death. O is for luxury. Is for offspring. Is for earth.
Is for
P is for
S for parent.
is for female.
Q
G
is for quiet.
is for govern.
Z
H
is for return.
is for health. P I is for poor. Is for ill. Q J is for quiet. Is for justice.
Is for us.
K
V
is for kind
is for
hand.
value.
L
W
is for luxury. M is for misery. N is for never. Is for us. O is for orator. Is for valued. P W is for poor. Is for widow. Q X is for quiet. I is for radical. S is for system. T is for treason. U is for us. V is for valued. W is for widow. X is for. Y is for years. Z is for. Is for.
So we've got Rachael Finney here, the artist for the piece that we've just watched, who is we've invited to speak to us today about her work and about how it links into the project that Anna and I are currently working on. hopefully, yeah, we'll have a chat that kind of meanders in amongst some questions, and talk about things that have influenced the work that Rachel's done, things that she's responded to in from our work, but also some of the themes that are kind of coming up that might influence back into our work as well. So it'd be nice to have that exchange.
So I'm going to actually just do a read intro for this bit, so that we've got a little bit of a context as to why we want to speak to you, Rachel. So there are so many layers to your work which we felt could draw out themes and threads in our project. The ethereal and unearthly space that is reached through your work, which often sounds like incantations, and it creates this transient realm which we enjoy. The plane of existence in which the female voice operates in your work is foregrounded, and yet it comes from the background, just as the female reformers operated as both speakers on platforms and clandestine plotters, at once shouting and yet subjugated and unheard. How your work crosses time, as the recorded is replayed and then re-recorded. This loop of time materialises in our project through the archival history being distorted, reenacted and revived through the work with the community. The paralinguistic element, the non-verbal and dissected communication in your work, also occurs in our project through symbol, coded image and material action. The voice separates from the body in your work, seeking and affecting its own power, and in a way we are harnessing a power that is beyond the actual female reformers as humans, that exist then in the realm of myth and material. So that's a good intro, I think. What were you working on when we first approached you about this project?
Well, at the moment, and when you did approach me, I was very much in the space of kind of writing and researching, rather than kind of making and researching. And actually your kind of request came at a really, really good moment, because it kind of caused me to begin thinking about some of my research in a slightly different way, through action, through kind of sound and kind of performance. But I guess the core thing that I've been working on for a while is a body of research that thinks about those voices that have been situated kind of in and the background, and voices that speak in, of and from the background, and how the background is kind of constructed in different ways. It's often, to be in the background is to be behind something, or to be behind something that is foregrounded. So my research has been trying to think about how might you attune to those voices that are situated in the background, that doesn't drag them into the foreground, that kind of allows a proximity. It allows them to remain in the background, but to listen to the background kind of it requires, or it demands, that you listen differently. I guess one of the things that I'm interested in is how the background could be, because things in the background are obscured or slightly out of reach. There's for me a power in that, to be able to flex, to be able to move, and not be kind of captured by a visual kind of space. So how then do you listen to the background without kind of destroying it, basically? So that's kind of what a lot of my research has been thinking about over the last few years, and trying to use the performance that I undertook for this exhibition to think about that, to kind of keep some of those sounds slightly inaudible or slippery, or
like an oral glimpse.
Yeah, like I'm really interested in how, how do you listen on the edge of attention, like things that you can't quite
centralize in some way. So what kind of listening does that require, or does that demand? Like, that really interests me. I don't know, I find, you know, your ear kind of reaches out to things in a way. It's able to move way past like often what you can see. It's able to capture things that don't have to be seen, that don't have to be part of a kind of visual world. But how can you listen and not just hear? How can you listen, but on the things that are deliberately on the edge of attention? I'm not sure if I have come up with a conclusion to that question, but I like trying to think about it in my work, at least anyway.
I think it's such an interesting idea, and you've spoken to Anna previously about that idea of backgrounding and foregrounding, and it really resonates quite a lot with what we're talking about. We're talking about female reformers were backgrounded in a lot of different ways, and even when they mounted the hustings at the meeting, they were still backgrounded by the men, really. Like it wasn't their place. So there's a really interesting like parallel there, and I think as well it kind of conjures up a lot of the things that Anna and I have been talking about these like seditious meetings as well. These kind of, you know, was that somebody just going past in the woods, or was that, you know, like these kind of glimpses of a person or a group that are meeting and that are having these conversations that you can't quite hear,
and nobody sort of, I mean, the kind of the way that they're then being reported is mishearings and conjectures and complete and utter made up stuff, because no one actually quite knows what's happening in these places. No one quite knows what's being said. No one quite knows how dangerous or undangerous or what these things are. And particularly in the position of the hustings, like the women were kind of often in these positions where they were kind of like peripheral eye candy. You know, like, because they would wear a certain clothing to represent sort of innocence, and laurel wreath to represent sort of like purity and wisdom, and then would just be handing over a thing.
And also,
you know, like it was a kind of like, you know, here's the cap of liberty, you know, like, so kind of recreating sort of medieval style knights and ladies kind of actions, but they were sort of performing these things to the men.
And even like with the banners, like the banners processed, and the women would flank the banners because they were a protection for the banners, that people wouldn't harm the women, therefore they wouldn't harm the banners. So they were backgrounded to the banners.
I mean, I love that. Yeah, that even in that moment, yeah, they become, but then also in that moment, you know, that it begins to perhaps hint at the potential of the background as an incredibly significant space, that when it is in this instance kind of used to protect a piece of material, you know, a sign, a symbol, but actually it cannot be passed, it cannot be, yeah, it does something. And yeah, it's definitely, it's problematically like indexed in this case along gender, which is, you know, but it does speak to the ability for the background to be able to do something, to be able to produce space in a particular
or to have
way.
Agency of some sort, like some, not the agency within themselves, but like, yeah, that there's like power within that.
Like without that kind of background, then the foreground then makes less sense.
Yeah,
like they're fulfilling a kind of role as well, about kind of like structuring a sort of like a three-dimensional space.
It becomes this space that the kind of lead in the, you know, say a man at the hustings speaking, becomes grounded. It becomes the space within which they're able to function, because without them they're just, as you say, some guy ranting, you know. So then the background, you, by thinking of it slightly differently, you realize that it's highly productive, like it, and maybe even like a really potentially like a really radical space where movement and all sorts of things might happen. But how do you attend to it or think about it in a way that you don't, you know, to enter into the background is to potentially destroy it as the background. It becomes your foreground. So how do you work in ways that try and keep things slightly out of reach or out of earshot? Or
that sounds like a difficult thing to do as an artist, to sort of attend to that. It's like you're
yeah.
You take yourself out of work.
You just set yourself up to fail, like every time you're doing something, like, oh, that didn't work, or the way that you write about it. But I guess that's the I say fun, maybe it's not always fun, but that's the dilemma kind of thing. Like, how do you do this? And maybe you can't, and maybe that's what's also kind of what makes it so fascinating, is because it as soon as you get close to it, even in a kind of conceptual way, it moves away from you. It slips away.
Yeah,
You
I mean, like,
can't.
in terms of like so you perform, do you always perform live? I know you recorded your live performance.
A mixture, really. I do kind of, yeah, a lot of my work does kind of come out through performance, but I also work with kind of installation and like video and tape at some stage of the process, whether it's an installation using tape machines, or a sound installation that has perhaps used tape at some part of its kind of making process. But increasingly, performance is has become, I guess, very much how my work seems to kind of come out.
I think just saying that about how in that moment things flex and change and shift, and like that seems to be like a very live thing, and you feel it when I was watching it, just, yeah, sort of transfixed by the movements, but also knowing that any kind of movement that you're making and selecting different objects is affecting that sound that cannot be replicated again. It is very much in the performance, and also I think the actions were really interesting, because me and Anna have been talking a lot about the actions of weavers, there's a few links and loops and you know, tapes and all these kinds of like tactile kind of elements.
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing that has, I think, really stoked this obsession almost with tape. I you know, I've been working with it for a long time in my practice, but I never tire of it as a material. It demands a kind of physical relationship, particularly when you're performing, because it can become sticky. It can snap, you can stretch it, you have this kind of particular, or at least I'm interested in how my own body becomes part of what's going on, that it's not just kind of pressing play or pressing stop, but your own you can kind of interrupt or unsettle what's happening in some way by just subtly putting your hand, you know, on a reel, or giving more tension to a tape loop, or reducing the tension of it in some way. And that for me is, whether it's interesting for an audience, it's interesting as a performer to work in that way. And I think I quite like the openness of things being always in a semi-improvised state.
I think it is really interesting to
I think it's fascinating.
It's fascinating, and it's like I say, it is reactive, and it's like you're embodying that as well. It is part of you, and it's the instincts that are like kicking in as well.
I think as well, there's something that I kind of realized was, even though performance is clearly quite is a very significant part of my practice. I get incredibly anxious having to perform, or but working in this way means that it, for me, that in that moment of performance, I kind of just can really focus on what I'm doing, and almost be in this kind of conversation with the machines and the tape, and it allows me to not really think of it as a performance. It I don't know, it kind of eases certain anxieties that I have around performing. I think, you know, increasingly though, I mean, because of the just kind of the restrictions of the frame with the performance I did for you, was I didn't want to be out of the frame too much, so I deliberately kind of limited the size of the loops, but kind of increasingly, you know, I'm interested in, you know, when you work in a, or you perform in a bigger space where you can really separate kind of your tape players out, it becomes an incredibly physical performance, which is, you know, is interesting, because to ensure that tape is coming through, you kind of end up using like much more of your body than you maybe would think you would. That's, I think, something that is, again, something that interests me, is the way that even though you're working with sound, actually it becomes this incredibly physical performance, even though that's not why you're doing it, but it has that aspect to it. And tape becomes, I mean, tape doesn't necessarily weave, but it becomes knot. I guess we could think of a knot as a weave.
Yeah, we're thinking about knots as weaves, sort of.
Yeah, you know, like a really complicated weave.
Spin is knotting. Yeah.
I mean, this thing of like watching you work and like watching you spin and stuff was obviously because we're in this realm at the moment of thinking about these women. Like, they were all weavers, like they worked as weavers. Lee, particularly the female reformers of Lee, were all weavers, though a lot of them around Greater Manchester were as well. And this kind of like relationship that they had with the fact that they were labouring people, they were workers, they worked with their hands, and they had a skill. This weaving and this spinning is kind of like a big part of an almost like a sort of identity of that whole town and of these people's hands. So this memory of hands, that which kind of is, so it's not a kind of, not a genetic memory, but it's a sort of like it's a ground memory, like like an earth memory almost of elements. And I just thought it was interesting just to show you this photograph. This woman this was probably taken in the 1910s. So she could well have been born just afterwards. She could be the daughter of a reformer.
I love this idea that somebody might be the daughter.
Oh, wow.
But I just love her like spinning her thing with her massive wheels.
I mean, it could be like, just put a tape head on there.
Yeah, exactly. You just put a tape head on that, and it's like, what
an amazing tape player.
I think as well, it's like when you talk about these, like the bigger installations that you can make where they become really physical, it's like, it's that same thing, like the machinery and the kind of, it's a very physical act to be creating from start to finish. It's a very physical thing to do. I wanted to kind of bring up, because obviously in your piece there are these like murmurs and these sounds, these like these glimpses, but then you've got the alphabet, and I wondered if this was something that was like based on the bad alphabet, the female reformers' bad alphabet.
I would love to say it was, but I actually was not,
I kind of love if it isn't,
aware of the bad alphabet. But I was thinking about the use of voice as a way to educate. I was thinking about with the limited knowledge I have about the reformers, but what I was aware of was that the education was a thread of kind of activism that they were interested in, and education for and with their children. And I was thinking, well, how, the role of language there, the role of learning words, like what happens if you begin to shift the alphabet that
such a good
might have been used, like A is for apple. So I was thinking of how might you change the alphabet to start to use terminology that maybe starts to resemble some of the ideas that might have been relevant at the time. Yeah, I ended up doing kind of 3 versions of the alphabet that then became kind of woven in the kind of live performance. There were 3 different reels that were playing 3 different versions of the alphabet.
Strong though, like I thought the contrast of the 2 sides of the piece was really, like, it just felt like this building up, and especially like the layering up of textural sounds and then the words as well. It was beautiful. It was kind of spine tingling, and the words were just, I mean, like I was thinking of a bad alphabet and just thinking, oh, this is amazing. And so it is kind of nice in a way that it wasn't about but it was coming from the same place. It was coming from that exact place.
I had recorded my own voice, but these almost like cheering kind of kind of symbolic, non-word based kind of utterances that you might get in a kind of crowd, some kind of protest or event where just the articulation of a sound through your throat would be kind of communicative. So I kind of knew I wanted to start there. I don't know how kind of audible I didn't really mind if it wasn't particularly audible, but I wanted to start there, and then the voice, use recordings of the voice where it's kind of pulsing, or it's just very tonal, and then slowly begin to become words, slowly become language through the alphabet. So even though it was a kind of highly improvised performance, in the sense that I wasn't complete like timing, right, I've got to do this bit now, it wasn't anything like that, but I kind of knew, I had this idea of these movements that I wanted the voice to make through the work, and then become kind of almost overwhelmed with the alphabet. So then it becomes confused, it's not settling on anything, it's not settling on B is for this, it keeps shifting again and again, so it won't settle on one definition and then just kind of end with this kind of emptiness. I didn't know too much about the story of Electra, but it was through this residency that I'm working with an artist called Johanna Garacadi, who we began talking about my interest in voice and her interest and knowledge of kind of Greek mythology, and how we might kind of develop a work in response to that. But my perspective of it, because we were interested in working together, but not necessarily to produce kind of one work. So we were very interested in like working together, and what we produced was a kind of doubling of our interests. So my particular interests with this piece was how these kind of disembodied voices that occur in kind of acoustic situations. So you kind of, particularly in this area, you could hear people speaking all around you, but you just couldn't, you would never see them. So you were surrounded by these like disembodied acoustic voices kind of everywhere you went. So I was interested in kind of trying to surround the narrative with these ever moving, ever kind of fluctuating vocal kind of sounds, which again kind of links back to my interest in the the background, I guess.
Well, it's an interesting, I just found it really interesting that you've kind of like approached this myth and voice thing, because one of the directions that that I've particularly been, but also both of us together have been looking at, is the depictions of the women in political and satirical print of the time. So like reformers and reforming movements and the female reformers and other reformers of the time are kind of like a major part of like political print of that era. And the main reference point that political print uses is it's an assumptive knowledge of, it's an assumption of your knowledge of myth.
Right.
The whole language is
pretty elitist, surely. Like, it's pretty elitist.
Oh yeah.
Well, who knows loads about myths?
Yeah. But satirical print was a semi-populist medium, because the print shops and stuff would be like the main galleries that people would have access to seeing. They'd just be out on the streets. But the knowledge base of the people who are doing them they're constantly pulling on and repeating elements of myth. So if you don't start learning your myths, you don't get half the references. So you partly need to know who they're talking about in terms of politicians, particular famous ones who keep appearing a lot, or ones who are about that month, like who are appearing, who are obviously the portraits, but you don't know who they are if you don't then try and look back on that history. But the myth element is this constant, is a constant framework in which stuff is hung from, what they're talking about. And so I've been finding that really fascinating, because it's the same with the Hansard scripts, where people are referencing myth all the time in these speeches given by the Lords and by the MPs at the time who were talking about reformers. They make these little references to Amazons and all these little things. I mean, I suppose like Boris Johnson wants to think that he's like that now, but you know, they're kind of like, but they'll sort of use these kind of like mythological like frames which make sense to everybody. And I'm finding it really interesting, because I'm having to now we're having to read and dig and look back at who that might be. It's like, it feels like a vocabulary it's so often referred to, and it's even referred to now as, you know, it's this grand vocabulary that you're not necessarily party to.
I guess just thinking about what you're saying, like the role of myth from a satirical point of view becomes a kind of another way to kind of create double meanings or code things in a certain way, which, if that's what maybe those in power, you know, if that's what they could do, then there's always space for other those not in power to use that as well, or not use myth necessarily, but use things that can be coded or doubling, or you know, certain inflections on certain words can completely like change, you know, their meaning. Or kind of reminds me of what's it called, that Lucia Irigaray text, like the Plato's Hystera, like Plato's Cave, I can't remember, but she kind of, in her writing, she's talking about Plato's Cave, but she's also using kind of the voice of Freud, but in a really kind of snarly way, where she's kind of almost deliberately ventriloquizing his voice, but to undo what it is he's saying. So she kind of uses this doubling through writing in a really particular way, you know, so kind of repeating what he's saying, but with a totally different inflection, to be like, shut up, Freud, you know.
I think it's interesting, that idea as well, is like the sort of, these Lancashire women are witches in politics, and then the more we look at witches and witchcraft and women who were accused of being witches, you kind of go, yeah, all right, yeah, I'll take that, yeah, that is what we are.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
You know, like it's a done deal. And like the unpicking of that, and like the doubling, like you say, of like taking those things and reclaiming those things and turning them into something else, turning that language into something else, that ability to take on those attributes and to use them in the right way. It seems like yeah,
I mean,
something
they
that
did very much kind of play on, like, I mean, the laurel wreath kind of like, you know, headband type thing, and that sort of ancient, I mean, you know, it's a Roman emperor kind of look. You know, they were kind of, I mean, they had like additional layered meanings, but they were completely into framing themselves in that same context. And they weren't all just working people. So there was MPs and other middle class and upper class people who were in support of and champions of their cause. I mean, Henry Hunt himself was landed gentry of some description, who was the kind of the main speaker at the reform meeting that became Peterloo. So like they weren't all the reformers side were not ignorant to the language of the satirical prints and stuff like that, and would also use it, and then that would filter down in the way that sort of pamphlets were getting put out and what they were sort of talking about. So it wasn't completely, in terms of sides, one side didn't have the language and the other didn't. But it definitely feels like now it's a kind of barrier to not have that deep knowledge, because you're looking at things that are so complicated. The imagery is so complicated, particularly in the satirical prints. It's so layered and it's so complicated, and every element has been put in there for some form of reason or another. And some of it's contemporary reference to the time, some of it's mythological reference, some of it's not so much mythological reference, but it'll just be like a phrase of the time or something, you know, not a right. You know, so it's a contemporary reference, but then it'll like just be like a meme that's going around. And like the banners that we're using, that we've created with in the workshops, are these cuckolding banners, Skimmington banners, which I knew what they were from research that I'd done into those banners before, but they don't even necessarily make sense now to see when you see them depicted in mythological. You see them depicted in these satirical prints, you just assume it's like a kind of weird banner of somebody's clothing, but it's a really specific form of public shaming ritual that was used against men who were being seen as being cuckolded by their wives. So it's a really, really symbolic thing, but it's like a little reference in the background that you wouldn't. It's like in the corner somewhere.
On the actual banner itself, there's a female St. George riding a dragon, like sexually kind of like, you know, contorting with this dragon, and it's tiny, and you just kind of making it out.
She's a voluptuous female St. George having this kind of like sexual violent tussle with the dragon. I mean, that's kind of like, that has blown our minds, because why is that a bad thing?
I was gonna say, like, dragon depiction sounds amazing. You know, this woman's like, dragon. You know?
It's like St. George, like, is obviously the hero of that story. Yeah. So if she's St. George, is she not good? And the dragon obviously must be the bad thing.
Yeah, exactly.
She still seems to be, you know, the dominant. She's just dominating the dragon, not like, oh well, you know, the dragon burnt, you know. Yeah, so you just this seems
absolutely fine.
Yeah. Do you think that the kind of the ability for these images to either legitimize or like kind of destabilize from both kind of sides, or do you think that the kind of part of their power lies in the fact that they do have these incredibly subtle, not, you know, backgrounded, layered kind of little hooks that you know, that the fact that it could be overlooked by somebody who didn't understand or didn't, you know, wasn't in on the joke, that's where they get that power, the ability for other people to be able to realize or not realize, or understand or not understand,
like to miss the point.
Yeah. So if you know, then I saw that tiny detail.
There also just feels like there's a sort of like a richness to an understanding of the world, that if you can kind of get into that, so you know, like to call somebody just a Medusa, like now it just seems like a one-off seem to have any real meaning.
Mm.
But it feels like it has much more backgrounded, layered meanings when they're saying it, because they're bringing it from an education that's got all of the background. So it's like, you know, I mean, Medusa herself is like a really fascinating character, because she was like such a victim, you know, the kind of the main famous one, you know, she was like, you know, was she like a rape victim or something, who then gets like turned.
Oh, I don't know.
She's like, yeah, she's got like a bad story. She's not a monster. She's a victim monster, not a, you know, which a lot of these are, which I just find interestingly layered. That
As you know, I mentioned about, you know, in the performance having these moments of an utterance that is not necessarily, is not attached to language, it's not, or at least specific words, that the, you know, that the voice is not just a vehicle for language, but is this kind of phonic kind of material that can kind of communicate and express outside of a specific kind of linguistic form or whatever. The work I did in this performance doesn't, it touches on that a little bit, but I guess the way that the female voice is often kind of detached from language, you know, is like the hysterical voice, the kind of wailing voice that is sometimes attached to female voices. But how can you reclaim that? How might you, there's a power in just making a sound. There's a power in just kind of you know, groaning or something. And I think that actually, you know, let's kind of recognize that power. I don't know, power is maybe a funny, maybe not quite the word I'm looking for,
like demonstrating a presence.
Yeah, completely, you know,
presence.
This in that moment of uttering, in that moment of making a sound, you know, it's there and then it's gone, but it was there, you know. And there's a as you say, there's a kind of there's a power in that, and there's a power in how fleeting it is, you know, that it doesn't stay, that it I won't get into like speech and writing and all of that, but I'm interested in those, you know, in just the sound of the voice, the kind of the textures of it, outside of kind of language, I guess. I think that to me is interesting, that it can evoke an emotional response, it can communicate, and just the sounding of their voices, you know, through speeches, through writing, through whatever, you think that's electrifying in a way, that in that moment of sounding, something happens, you know.
I really love that. The sounding of the voice is electrifying. I'm really into that.
Yeah. I like what you're saying about existence as well, Anna. I think like there's something, I've been doing some other work about pain and about how to sort of materialize experiences of pain, and something I was reading was about utterances and about how like language and pain don't really go together. Like, to even be in pain, you talk in you talk in sounds, you go or whatever that is, you make sounds, you don't use language anymore. So like that becomes like a really powerful thing as well, or like I don't know whether it is powerful, but it really like you are existing, you are sort of proclaiming that existence and that experience.
Experience as well, you're proclaiming experience.
There
And
is
it's
an
like an
incredible
so
artist and kind of researcher and writer called Eleni Akinadiu, and she has written kind of extensively and has done a lot of work around like mourners, like who would you know, kind of almost like professional mourners who would come and kind of wail almost, you know, during a kind of funeral. And it was it's a role that's historically been given to women. So this ability to express grief through non-symbolic kind of vocal sounds of wailing, of crying. There's she's done a lot of work on it, but there's a book that came out late last year, Unsound Undead, and there's a short text from her in that, but it's a great, her work's incredible.
Because like even though it's not been written anywhere, like particularly in the prints, again, if there's female reformers involved, they've often got their mouths open and they're obviously going like,
yeah
obviously there's no sound because it's a print, but like they're kind of flailing their arms and they've got torches and they've got really contorted faces and they're obviously making like a lot of racket. This idea that they're noisy is
but not what they're saying, just that they're noisy.
Just going, like,
yeah,
in the background, and you can hear it because you can see these faces. They're great, kind of contorted faces, like, but yeah, the noisiness of them.
Yeah, and as if, again, as we were, you know, talking about the kind of satirical imagery, like noise, you know, the voice in excess, the voice as it kind of in those moments where it is no longer kind of contained within the words that are being spoken, that these other parts kind of slip out through whatever, you know, being angry, being excited, that the voice in an excessive form is been framed as bad, as, you know, oh god, yeah. And it's like, well, actually, to make a noise, to proclaim, to resist, that, yeah, that's powerful. That's it can be problematic, you know. We can see noisy people gibbering away, like in politics, global politics, who aren't saying anything in there. But anyway, I don't want to go down there, but yeah, the idea of just the act of, I don't know, like in a moment of exasperation, sometimes you, in those moments, it's not enough to articulate something through language, that it needs to be expressed through sound. It, you know, because you're just like, I you know, there's no other way I can put this but through this. But I kind of, it always makes me, yeah, the tendency to frame the female voice as hysterical or excessive, or
I mean, it's like the kind of the tropes, the name calling tropes are things like fishwife.
Yeah.
You know, like, this is like excessively verbal, gibbering, kind of like jabbering, gossipy, you know,
yeah,
untrustworthy, loose-tongued.
yeah, all the, as if you're not in control, like, yeah, I guess is what it gets mapped onto, that you are unable to control yourself, your body is uncontrollable,
and it's emotional, and it's
irrational, against the rationality of men, you know. Yeah, all these things are played out again and again and again, but I like those moments of excess. I like those moments of, or I don't even think of them as excess. I like those other parts of the voice that that communicate, you know, that speak, as well as the words that you're using. That interests me.
It's been really amazing to chat to you, Rachel, and it's been quite an eye-opener in a lot of ways, in terms of like what we've talked about, how we can sort of take some of those ideas back into the space, and how we interpret some of the things that we're doing as well. So it's been really ace to talk to you, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me. Yeah, it's been fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks.